I'm Maisie Chan. I'm in Glasgow currently, and my debut novel was Chung Sums It Up, which came out 2 years ago with Abraham's Kids. And my follow-up novel just came out a couple of months ago. It's Keep Dancing, Lizzie Chu. And I've been writing, I worked this out the other day, 17 years I've been writing. So it's been quite a long time. And I started off with short stories for adults. And then I started writing seriously for children around 2016. And I just love writing for 8 to 12-year-olds from middle grade. I just love that story is such an important part of writing for children. And I'm really, I think it kind of, I get to work out some of my childhood stuff as well, I think, when I'm writing for children. So yeah, I really love writing for children. So that's mostly my journey. It's been a long journey.
Can you tell us a little bit more why this age group, the middle grade fiction?
Yeah, so I've written for adults, and I always find my adult fiction quite dark, a little bit depressing. And then I wrote a teen novel for sort of 13 to 16-year-olds, and it just, I don't know, it just didn't feel quite right for me at that time. It just, I don't know, there's something about the voice of writing for 8 to 12-year-olds that I like, that I connect with as well when I go to do school visits. I think there's still a lot of innocence and joy and inquisitiveness around the age group, where sometimes I go and talk to like high school kids here, which is sort of from 12 to 18 in England and Scotland. And sometimes I feel they're quite shy almost. They don't want to engage sometimes. Maybe they want to appear cool or something. So I find that just slightly younger, they're very enthusiastic, and I like that about
I mean, that definitely resonates with my own kids that are in that age group and ones that I've met. Like you said, there's still this energy and optimism too, right? And excitement. But you're able to get into some really serious issues. Like I was telling a little bit about the book. I don't know if you want to go into it more, that it gets into some heavy topics like being a caretaker, dealing with grief, and finding out who your real friends are. Could you talk a little bit more about your new book?
Yeah. So Lizzie is about to turn 12 in the book, and her grandma's just died the year before, Grandma Cam. So she has taken on the role of caretaker. So she's doing the shopping, she's helping to pay the bills by going to the post office. Because her granddad is not acting normally, you know, he's kind of forgetting things and is a bit erratic, but she doesn't realize that, you know, there's something going on with him as well. And she just kind of takes it on naturally. She just kind of fills her grandma's shoes quite naturally. But she's only, you know, she's only 12. So part of her, I think, really wants to be just a normal kid and have fun and go to Comic-Con with her friends. But then the other part of her feels, you know, there's no one else to do it, so I've got to do it. And partly that's based on my own experience. I was a young adult carer in my early 20s. So my mum, she had 2 failed hip operations and was in a wheelchair. And then my dad had some mental health issues. And later in life, after my mum died, actually, he kind of had clinical depression when she'd gone and wouldn't get out of bed. So I used some of that experience of trying to get him help and look after him, and use that for Lizzie, even though I was much older than Lizzie. That feeling sometimes a bit like you're frustrated that your friends sort of are moving on without you. That was kind of what I was trying to capture. But also this feeling of looking after someone is quite humbling as well. So I remember sometimes doing some chores and tasks that I thought, wow, I never thought I'd be, you know, bathing my mum or helping to do, you know, help my dad to get dressed and that sort of stuff. So I think it's quite humbling when you do that kind of work with family members. So I wanted to talk about these heavy topics, but I didn't want the book to be heavy. I wanted it to be a similar sort of humour to my first novel, Danny Chung Does Not. So it's called Danny Chung Does Not Do Matter in the UK, and it's called Danny Chung Sums It Up in the US. So it's a bit confusing. So there's a road trip and there's dressing up, and there are characters that they meet along the way. And I think in my life, you know, I've met quite interesting characters, you know, when I've traveled around the world and stuff. So I think in these hard times, sometimes you'll just meet someone and they'll make you smile and you think, okay, life's not so bad.
I have to say some of my favorite, there's so many wonderful characters, and the main, you know, Lizzie herself and her family and her friends they're really wonderful, but some of my favorite side characters are the female biker gang that she meets, who are really wonderfully helpful and help them in their journey and actually help her understand that she's a caretaker. I think that was like the first moment she, oh, is that what I am?
Yeah.
Like, is that what's going on here? You know, so just a lot of really fun kind of wacky characters, especially going to Comic-Con, of course, you're going to run into a lot, which I think is great, because you are, like you said, these are a heavy topic, and you somehow manage to keep it light without making it trivial. It's still serious, and you still really get into the issues, but it doesn't feel like a heavy book. And at the end, I think is still like a very hopeful, optimistic book.
Thank you.
That's
what I was
something else I was
for.
interested in. There's so much about the story that's universal, you know, talking about grief, talking about learning how to ask for help when you need it. And yet there are other elements that's very specific to Lizzie and her upbringing. She's Chinese, Scottish, which is a combination I don't think I've ever read a story about before. But you bring in a lot of those kind of elements, especially the stories of, I don't know if I know how to pronounce it, Guan Yin, to bring in those elements in.
Yes.
So what was your thinking as far as like finding the balance of like, okay, I want to have these universal themes people can relate to, but I also want to be true to her very specific situation. So how did you come up with like what that balance would look like?
So it's something that I try and do with a lot of my writing, actually. I feel like I'm quite British, you know. I grew up in England, and I think sometimes in literature, especially in Britain, where we don't have as much Asian American sort of authors as you guys have got over there, I wanted to have that universality to say, look, it's a British Chinese family, but actually we're just like you. We've got the same emotions. We're going through the same sort of trials and tribulations. You know, she's a carer. It doesn't matter what her race is. And then on the flip side of that is sort of saying, actually, she is a British Chinese carer, and these are the stories that her grandfather's telling to her to kind of link her to the past, to link her to China in some way. And it's similar to my journey, because I was adopted by white parents, and so I didn't have those stories, those myths and legends passed down to me. And so when I write these books, it's almost like I am trying to connect myself as well to my heritage and my culture. And Guan Yin was a special goddess that I kind of found in about 2008 during the Beijing Olympics. I remember the BBC paid for me to dress up as her and to story tell in Birmingham City Centre. And the more research I did on this goddess, I was like, wow, yeah, she's was a bodhisattva in the Buddhist tradition. So, you know, there was some articles saying that maybe she was like in a male form at one time, and she's this goddess of love and compassion and kindness and mercy. And I always wanted to write a story with her in it. And actually, there's a show on Disney, American Born Chinese, and Michelle Yeoh is playing a Guan Yin character. So I think quite a lot of Chinese diaspora writers put her into their books, because she's a goddess that people still pray to. She's very important in Chinese households. And I used to dress up as her, and I used to feel really connected to her in a weird way, even though I wasn't raised with her. And so I wanted to introduce her to like readers, and that's why I put these small stories, they're like interludes, into the book. And I think it is about introducing some Chinese culture, but keeping that European and Britishness as well. It's like, it is a balance, but that, I feel that's kind of my personality as well, and my journey.
Well, one of the things I thought was
as
really interesting too is that it's not just Chinese, British Chinese, but also there's a girl who's mixed of, I think, is Welsh and Vietnamese, and and even just talking about the Guan Yin character, that her family was like, oh wait, that's really similar to the goddess that looks like what I saw in Ma's house. So it's kind of nice to show like diversity within you know, British Asian. It's not all Chinese. It's, you know, all these. Yeah. And
Exactly.
what can you
Yes.
talk a little bit more about Guanyin and how you put it with it's the Journey to the West, I think is the name of the main story that you talked about, and how you kind of
Yeah.
incorporated into the main narrative that they kind of using it because they're having their own journey, which is paralleling
Yeah.
that story. How did you come up with the idea to do that?
Yeah. That was kind of later in the process. So I think I'd already done a first or second draft. And I was like, oh, okay, I've got these three Guanyin stories that are kind of creation stories. And then I was thinking, she's also in the Journey to the West, you know, with the Monkey King, who's a very famous figure. And it's the most famous Chinese novel ever written, The Journey to the West. And I thought, well, she's in that, so I want to put it in. And then I was like, okay, they go from Glasgow to Blackpool, which is the home of ballroom dancing in the world. And that's on the West Coast. So maybe I can kind of draw parallels and use this metaphor, because it wasn't, the Journey to the West really was about their own enlightenment, these individual characters who are a kind of motley crew bunch suddenly put together, and they overcome these obstacles, but actually it was this kind of internal enlightenment that they kind of found on the journey. So it wasn't the destination, it was a journey that was important. And I was just like, oh, that's kind of like Lizzie, like she thinks this trip to Blackpool is going to help her granddad get better, but actually the journey's where she learns about herself and she becomes more resilient, and by the end of that journey she knows what has to happen. And so yeah, it was kind of later in the process that I made that connection myself, actually. I was like, oh, this makes sense now. These are, you know, travelers as well, and they're going to overcome these obstacles and meet people on the way. And Guanyin sort of oversees all of that journey. And so it just felt right, and it just felt like it fitted together very
It's
well.
brilliant because also they're kind of self-conscious about the connection because Lizzie tells them the story as I can't remember if they're waiting for something or as they're driving, she tells them about it. And so they keep referring back to it themselves, like, hey, remember, we're overcoming obstacles just like they did, you know, and so
Yeah.
it just the way you kind of brought it into it, it just fits so naturally into the story. That's interesting to find out that was kind of a later addition. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes that happens. Like you'll write 4 drafts, and then suddenly on the last draft you're like, that connects. So yeah, sometimes like writings are very, sometimes it's very like formulaic, and you'll try and do a structure that you've done before, and then sometimes it feels magical where just stuff connects and you're like, oh, it feels like your
Right.
subconscious does
I
it.
love that. So, what was it like? I mean, I know you added that element, but what was like the kernel that started the Lizzie's story for you?
So I knew I wanted to write about a young carer and her granddad. So I knew that was the beginning of the story. And I wrote this during the lockdown, during the pandemic. And I watched a lot of Strictly Come Dancing, which is like Dancing with the Stars in the US. And it was just full of joy and colour. And it made me forget what was happening outside with the pandemic at the time. And I was just like, oh, this program, this dancing, it just feels like a really good motif for now, that we can get through it. You know, the celebrities would go for this journey. Some of them couldn't dance at the beginning, and by the end they've made friends with the dancers. They've learned to dance, and they've overcome these obstacles. So it just felt like, again, another parallel sort of show. And I wanted to kind of pay a homage to popular culture during the pandemic, because those dancers and the celebrities had to actually live together in bubbles. And also a lot of the TV shows and TV companies, they kind of had to sacrifice as well, and be in bubbles and get tested every day. So I just wanted to kind of recognize that, because it's a different art form, but we kind of ingest stuff, and I use popular culture in my books to try and connect with young people as well. So that's why I wanted to put the Marvel and Star Wars and stuff like that, because that stuff doesn't get old. You know, it's been around, Star Wars has been around for decades, and I think Marvel as well, and I think it will keep going for more decades. So, you know, some people say don't put popular culture into your books, but I think the ones that I choose, I think will go on for a long time, like Star Wars and Marvel. And I also saw that there was more East Asian representation on TV. So there's a whole chapter at Comic-Con where Lizzie and her friends meet some of their heroes. So again, it was this homage to representation and the increasing representation that we're seeing on our screens and in books as well. So that's kind of
Right.
what I wanted to do with it.
And I'm also curious because it is the British Asian experience, and I think if I'm right, you actually have lived in or visited the U.S. quite a bit also. So how can you compare the two experiences? You've talked a little bit about how like the literature, children's literature, is different in the two places. Do you think there's a difference, or is it fairly similar as far as the Asian American versus British Asian experience?
I think we're like 20 years behind almost in terms of Asian American studies, a representation. You know, I lived in America. I think it was the late 90s. I studied there. I went to UC Berkeley for a year because I did American studies. And when I was there, I was on the campus and it was 40% Asian. And I couldn't believe it. You know, I was always a token Chinese person in a British place. You know, in British places, I was always a token person. So when I got to Berkeley, you know, there was like bookstores, there was Asian American studies, there were Asian American writers, Amy Tan, Maxine Hong Kingston, etc. There was Connie Chung on TV. There was a Joylet Club, which I ended up writing my dissertation about. So even though I know Asian Americans, even now, they don't feel that they have enough representation compared to what we've got in Britain, it's much more. And so actually, it's kind of the opposite. So South Asians here are in the majority, and there are whole like towns where the majority is South Asian, and there'll be schools and classrooms where everyone will be South Asian. So the Chinese and, you know, Asian American in America, it's mainly Chinese and Korean and Japanese Americans, and then the South Asian Americans seem to be like left behind sometimes. They don't have as much representation or power. So here it's reverse. So here it's the South Asian community had more political power and just more community as well. So that was really interesting, seeing that whole reversal. And then when I got back to Britain, you know, in the late 90s, there was like literally, there were no children's books with British Chinese authors or East Asian authors that were born here. There were hardly any adult books either. And so I wanted to change that, and I became a writer to kind of change that. And it's taken decades, 2 decades, 3 decades still. You know, there's a handful of authors that look like me, and it's growing. So I know that there are new authors that are agented and they've got book deals now, and their books, you know, will come out this year and next year and the year after. But it's been such a long time, and I think that's to do with just the different immigration histories as well, and just the different, I guess, histories. Like we've got Empire, the British Empire here, and so we have more black population from Jamaica with the Windrush in the 60s, and from Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, but not so much. We had some from Hong Kong in the 70s and 80s, and now we're getting more people from Asia, from Korea and Japan, where in the past it was mainly Hong Kong Chinese. So there were very close communities as well. So that all adds to the literary landscape, I think. So from my books, you know, when my books came out in America, they weren't that new because you'd already had, you know, stories very similar to mine. But in Britain, they feel like they're very new. They're a very new thing. We've not had a book with a British Chinese boy on the cover before. So it feels here like it's a new exciting thing. So I'm just going with it. I'm just going, you know, yeah, we've not had much British Chinese representation.
Well,
I'm
wonderful. We're
that.
so glad you are. And I just want to, since you've been talking, I know you haven't seen the comments. You've gotten some really great comments about thank you for this conversation. I'm learning so much. Me too. It's amazing. So thank you all for those comments, and for you, Maisie. And I just want to go back to your point about how there isn't as much representation and not as many writers from East Asian or Southeast Asian descent, which is why it's so important, the Bubble Tea Writers Network. I imagine, to support each other. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yep. So in 2018, when I got my agent, I wanted to sort of pay it forward because I'd been helped before by other writers. So I offered free mentoring for a whole year on Twitter to one British Chinese writer because I'd had a whole year being mentored. So I wanted to do that as well. And a few writers applied. And when we kind of found each other on Twitter, we were like, wow, there's no space for us to like network or get to know each other. And one of them said, would you create a Facebook page, Maisie, where we can just get to know each other and share work? And I was like, yeah, and I'll post writing opportunities in there. And so it grew from about 5 writers, and now there's about 230 writers in the UK from East and Southeast Asian backgrounds. And I post writing opportunities in there, like writing competitions, mentoring, different opportunities that I see. But it's become a very sociable thing. So in London, they've got a WhatsApp group and they meet for dim sum every month, and everyone supports each other, even though they might be writing different age groups and genres. So it's become a really supportive space, and it's kind of the first time some people have met another writer from an East or Southeast Asian background. So that's, you know, that's how kind of how widespread it is that we don't know each other. And so this Facebook group, it's private, and you just ask to join if you're in the UK, you're interested in writing and you're from an East and Southeast Asian background, you can join. So yeah, people have formed really good friendships, and a lot of them have now got agents and their books are coming out. So I feel like a really proud auntie to see that how that's grown, and that, you know, I'm not going to be the only one, that there's going to be lots of people coming behind me. So yeah, that's
I love it. I love that you did that, that not only that your success, but that you brought others with you, that you're helping them and paying it forward on the mentorship that you got. That's wonderful.
Thank you. And it's free, you know, putting some opportunities in Facebook doesn't cost me much of my time. And it's, you know, it's just been a really good way to meet other people and support each other. And if an editor comes to me with a commission that I can't do, I try and pass it on to one of them and say, do you want to do this book? So yeah, it's been really beneficial to lots of
I'm just watching the time, and so we're going to have to wrap things up, although I feel like I could talk to you for a really long time. But do you want to end by telling us what you're working on now, or things that you have coming up?
Yeah, so I write a younger fiction series called Tiger Warrior. So I'm writing 3 more of those, and they're kind of fantastical books for newly independent readers like Beast Quest. So I'm working on some of those, and I'm working on a new novel which will have a historical element. So I'm researching the Chinese labor court in World War One, and I'm also going to write about a transracial adopted boy in that book as well.
Oh,
and
I can't wait for those. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us. It's wonderful to talk with you.